Questions, comments from the floor?
Is Milton in his writing that concerned with the violence itself? Or is the focus of the play something else? It appears to me that we are removed from the violence by at least one step every time it's reported. Constantly, this is a play, you could in some way display it as a spectacle, but that's not what happens. Instead, we hear a constant back and forth dialogue between, I think, two major voices, in a sense. Voices of certainty, i.e., I'm certain that this is what's supposed to be happening, and one voice of uncertainty. That is Samson saying, I can put my fault here, I can say you're doing this, I can be certain about all those things, but I cannot be certain about where Providence has led me and to what degree I have diverged from Providence, and whether or not Providence will return. Does that make much sense? And like the way I'm trying to formulate the question is basically, how relevant is violence to that theme, and whether or not that theme central in the way that I'm portraying, in your opinions?
I think that if you don't talk about violence, but talk about the force of justice instead, and see Milton as preoccupied with what is just and trying to figure out what is just, and have Samson try to figure out what is just, then once he figures out what is just, he's going to enforce that.
How would you relate that to that nice short little piece on the Iliad by Simone Weil? The poem of force, the Iliad or the poem of force? Is that the same sort of thing except from a pagan or Greek kind of deterministic perspective? That is, everybody at some point or another is subject to force, to the way reality is working itself out. Milton wants to think of Providence, or this instrument of force, as a benign determinant of events. And yet, if you look at it from another point of view, like the ancient Greeks, it's nothing except what you hope doesn't hit you too soon, because you're going to end up being crushed by it.
And that's why I think where his biblicism becomes very important, because the biblical vision, in contrast to the one in the Iliad, would have to maintain that this force has to be to ensure justice. It's not force for the sake of force, for a show of power or conquest.
Michael Lieb, in Theological Milton, his most recent book, argues that there's a whole lot more Old Testament God in Milton than people would like to acknowledge. And if that's so, then to go back to the question of violence, Milton would presumably be quite comfortable with violence in and of itself as part of the instrument of this force. I tell you the truth, I'm not sure I agree with Michael, though it's a beautiful, beautiful argument and fascinating book. So that's a question, and it's a good question. You know, to what extent is Milton's God the full force out violence, making the point even more clearly, that we can interpret from parts of the Old Testament, and to what extent does he mitigate that by not actually showing the spectacle, for example?
But though he couldn't, I mean, it's closet drama, he can't show it anyway. He has to have, I mean, it has to be something reported. It's also interesting, Stephen Dobronsky wrote about the omissa that's in the first edition of Paradise Lost, the passage where Manoah Tuckle, what if he, he grew his eyes back, and even now he's there slaughtering his enemies and walking over them right and left. And he says, and Dobronsky makes a plausible argument that this was a deliberate. There's no other omissa in 17th century bibliographical texts. You can't find texts where this category. You have errata, but you don't have omissa, this omitted thing. And what's given special prominence is this vision, reported vision, this description of Samson not dying among his friends, which seems to be the side of the tragedy that works for pity, but instead utterly triumphant and just killing them all, and that's what's been omitted, and that by Providence, that's what God really, I mean, that's what Milton really would have liked to have seen God do, or at least Manoah would have really liked to have seen God do. I guess my response then would be to say that I don't think that he's trying to distance us from that violence, that he does at least he's willing to deal with it head on, and I'm not sure that we are. I mean, certainly many of our colleagues have been trying to say that Milton clearly disapproves of this, and otherwise he couldn't be a sensitive poet, and so forth. And I think that I find that to be a kind of, I find that almost more frightening, actually.
Like, I guess that gets at the heart of what I was concerned about is our fascination or obsession with the violence in this text indicative of like an attempt to contextualize it for us, and rather reading in what the themes that are relevant to our interests rather than the themes that were relevant to Milton.
Well, I think that's Professor Fish's fourth category.
No, but I think that if you look at the criticism before 20th century criticism, you will find people fascinated by the question of violence and a lot of disturbance. Now, in Paradise Regained, as you all know, in his meditation or recollection of his own life, Christ talks about the temptation of using arms to free the Israelites from various states of bondage and idolatry. But he decides no, to use persuasion rather, and use, in effect, the word. But of course, there's a very old tradition which you can find all over the century, especially, let's say, a little later on in Bunyan, where the word is the sword, and people are literally clubbed and hit and felled by the word in the Pilgrim's Progress, and that kind of language is something that you will find in other homiletic literature in the century. So the distinction that we want to make, which is classically liberal distinction between speech and action, between the word and physical force, may not be as sharp a distinction as we are obliged to make it by a liberalism which needs to distinguish the public sphere from the private sphere precisely so that it can keep strong religious impulses confined and cabined. The one thing liberalism doesn't want is a religiosity that does not respect the line between public and private. Because as liberalism sees, once you step over that line, there is no end of the acts that you can justify.
And you could argue, to get back to Andy's question, that that's what the genre of tragedy, that's how it is born. If you look at Nietzsche's arguments about the emergence of the actor who gives rational form to whatever these Dionysian energies are within the festival of Dionysus, and somehow channels it for a public. And you think of the bird, what the Oresteia does in order to, validate this transformation of vengeance into justice and so forth. That maybe that's what the genre is about, is through that catharsis, somehow channeling that terribly violent energy in a fashion that's containable. So you don't end up killing each other and eating each other's children and killing your wife and your, whatever they do, or killing your mother or killing your father. With all of those terrible, violent actions that occur within Greek tragedy.